Testing. Yeah.
Can you hear me on this microphone? All right. If you haven't seen it behind the chairs, there's a code for you to put on your phones and get to Slido. We'll be using Slido today for Q&A to ramp up, especially given the short amount of time we have together with you. Also on the slide here today, all right? We have just an exceptional lineup this year, just as we did last year, but in addition to that this year, I am going to introduce Ambassador Jonathan Hennig, who is the U.S. Ambassador to the country of Uzbekistan, our U.S. Embassy in Tashkent. Ambassador Hennig was sworn into the U.S., is a part of the Senior Foreign Service, was sworn in as a U.S. Ambassador on October 14th, previously serving as Consul General in Istanbul, Turkey. Prior to that, he served as the U.S. Department of State Chair at the College of Information and Cyberspace at the National Defense University. And he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Central Asia Affairs, Public Diplomacy and Press. He also served as Acting Deputy Coordinator of the Global Engagement Center, where he helped to lead and coordinate all U.S. government efforts to counter disinformation from Russia, China, and Iran. He served as the Principal Deputy Coordinator and Acting Coordinator for the Bureau of International Information Programs, and as Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary and Director for Press and Public Diplomacy in the Bureau for South and Central Asian Affairs, where he was responsible for the conduct of U.S. public diplomacy in 13 countries, including Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. Ambassador Hennig has served overseas as the Counselor for Public Affairs in Turkey, the Deputy Chief of Mission in Timor-Leste, as well as other positions in Azerbaijan, Türkiye, Portugal, and Uzbekistan. Originally from New York, he speaks Russian, Portuguese, Turkish, Azerbaijani, and holds a PhD in political science from the University of Hawaii and a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University. Please welcome Ambassador Hennig.
If I had known you were going to read my whole bio, I would have stopped you. Janelle told me I could say whatever I want, but I think what she really meant was I should say as little as possible so that you can all hear from the experts here on this panel. I will just say a couple things. I want to welcome everybody today and thank the U.S. Commercial Service, thank Janelle Weck, who's our commercial advisor to the EBRD, as well as commercial specialist Crystal Dennis, who's instrumental in organizing this panel. As I think most of you know, the United States, of course, is the largest shareholder of EBRD, and we have worked assiduously over the last several years to strengthen our relationship and cooperation with EBRD, particularly in the area of making sure that U.S. industry and private sector have a good understanding of and good access to EBRD. This panel is designed with that in mind, not only for U.S. companies, of course, but for any companies. We have to this end, also have a special a commercial service advisor that works at the EBRD that works directly with U.S. industry, does outreach, helps U.S. companies navigate EBRD tenders, and works on private financing. And in general, I just want to make sure, particularly for U.S. companies out there, that you're aware that we have these services and are eager to help you whenever we possibly can. This is true, of course, at all of our embassies, including my own in Tashkent, as well as other embassies in the region. To that end, I'd like to just point out that here we have David Anderson here from our U.S. Embassy in Kyrgyzstan. We have Janelle Edens here from our U.S. Embassy in Kazakhstan. Any questions about those countries, please get in touch with my colleagues. So, in May 2022, the U.S. Department of Commerce signed a memorandum of understanding with EBRD, the first of its kind with any multilateral development bank. And this panel today is really a direct result of that MOU. The third such panel, and what we have pleased to present for you today are EBRD experts on infrastructure who can talk a little bit about the EBRD's process and answer any questions that you might have. I imagine there will be some questions. Even in the last year and a half, the global situation has changed quite dramatically. Russia's war against Ukraine, of course, has led to a whole raft of sanctions that complicates business, complicates EBRD tenders, not to mention, of course, the changing shipping routes around this part of the world. So finally, let me just conclude by saying we're really delighted that we have so many representatives from the private sector here today, and we hope that you'll take advantage of this panel and explore continued opportunities to work with EBRD going forward. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Janelle. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, panel. For most of you, the third year we've been able to do this together. A couple of you, just a couple of years. And so one of the things that's really neat about this panel, these are, as you know, the directors in the Sustainable Infrastructure Group inside of EBRD. And in this panel, what we've focused on is looking to the future. We'll have examples of successes in the past, just to give you an idea. But let's start with a scene setter. A little bit different than what we did last year in Morocco, if you were there. But I'm going to ask each one of our panelists to just spend a few minutes giving us set the scene. You know, talking about what is the single most important objective for EBRD to achieve in your sector and your region over the next 12 to 24 months. Aida, let's start with you.
Thank you very much, Janelle. I think for the context, we have to realize there is a climate emergency, of course, including in our regions. We see weather events, extreme weather events. We have different types of negative impacts on the economies. So the energy sector, and I represent the energy sector, I'm just half of the energy sector within the bank. My geography goes from Mongolia to Morocco, the easiest way to explain. So it's Central Asia, it's Caucasus, Türkiye, and the MENA region. And we already see the impacts. So what do we do? And we know these are one of the most highest carbon intensity countries that we have, or in the world even. So what do we do? The overall push to address the climate change, of course, is to electrify, to switch to electricity, as many activities as possible. Energy sector is at the center of providing this electricity, and this electricity has to be clean. And clean sources of energy, as we see, is renewables, as the cheapest, they are sustainable by nature, and they are secure. You can't weaponize the renewables. So our focus is really in the next 12 to 24 months to continue scaling up renewables, including, as we did in this country. Last year we financed 1.5 gigawatt of renewables in Uzbekistan, and help countries move along the low carbon pathways that we're developing for them. At the same time, we're not forgetting networks, transmission grid infrastructure that will enable those countries to absorb those growing shares of renewables. And we are looking into new energy vectors like green hydrogen, early stage, but we already have a finance project. We are looking at things like storage. So everything that will create this environment where countries can switch from fossil fuel to something more cleaner, sustainable, and cheaper.
That's terrific. Thanks, Aida. Grzegorz, it makes sense to maybe go to you next since you're the other half of the energy sector.
That's my pleasure and privilege. Thank you very much. Look, I'm covering Energy Europe, which means the countries that geographically lie within Europe. But even though that region is not necessarily homogeneous, I mean, my team covers countries in the north part of that region, which are already part of the European Union, which we refer to as the advanced transition countries. And the challenges there are different. They're also very different to challenges faced by Western Balkans, and completely different to those faced by Ukraine or Moldova today. So let me just do a quick tour among those three regions. In the most advanced part of the region, we usually see a well-established renewable energy support schemes that do not need to be tested. So our role, our challenge is to accelerate renewables through alternative ways of financing and taking into on our books the risks that cannot be taken by other lenders. And perhaps I will get a chance to go back to this point a little bit more in details later during our panel, but this is effectively about creating an alternative offtake arrangements for investors in renewables. Now, I'm not repeating Aida, because accelerating renewables is her priority, but it's also priority for my region. We're just doing slightly different things. Now, in Western Balkans, quite often we're still at the stage where it's the EBRD as a development bank that helps to develop a regulatory and support framework for renewables. And we've been very successful with supporting first auctions in Albania. We have just finished some additional work in Serbia and Montenegro, and hope to see those auctions resulting into first renewable energy projects under this new support schemes developed and constructed in Western Balkans. And the third region is effectively Ukraine plus Moldova, where energy security is absolutely top priority. And while we are gearing up and will build back better in Ukraine and Moldova as well, at this stage is more about securing liquidity of the power sector, and that's why just over the last 12 months, EBRD has supported Ukrenerga, the main player in the country, with the liquidity lines, and that's what we intend to continue doing in those countries as a priority in the next, well, whatever it takes.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Susan, how about you kick us off on the other side of infrastructure?
Thank you. So just, first of all, for the countries I follow, it's the exact same countries as Grzegorz, minus Moldova. But I thought I'd just briefly introduce infrastructure. In the Sustainable Infrastructure Group, we've got our energy colleagues, and for us, infrastructure covers transport and municipal. For transport, we covered all modes of transport. That's rail, road, aviation, maritime, including logistics, and on the municipal side, all sectors where the municipality can be the counterpart, and that's water, wastewater, urban transport, solid waste, district energy, urban revitalization, energy efficiency, et cetera, et cetera. But for me, similar to Grzegorz, the three regions have very different needs, but I would say if there's one resounding theme, it's decarbonization. The war in Ukraine has hit both municipal and transport players very hard, thanks to rising energy costs as well as interrupted supply chains. So in Europe, what we're seeing is increased focus on moving to electric transport, the modal shift, as well as enhanced logistics. And a lot of this is to improve connectivity with Ukraine, because with the Black Sea ports closed, a lot of trade goods are now going through Poland. So there's a huge interest in this, and we're trying to work with both public and private sector, but also thanks to rising energy costs, there's a huge focus on what can be done to decarbonize and to move away from using fossil fuels. And in this region, because as Grzegorz said, it's advanced transition, we tend to work more with the private sector or else working directly with municipalities. Then if we go to the Western Balkans, this is an area where also they're still dependent on coal, but the basic needs and infrastructure services are at a much lower level. They haven't had years of benefiting from EU grants. So here, in addition to focusing on decarbonization, I would also say there's a focus on solid waste and wastewater treatment to help these countries, which many of now are EU accession countries, meet EU directives. And finally, Ukraine. The war has, impacted Ukraine a lot, and like Grzegorz, our role is to continue to support the delivery of vital infrastructure services. So we indeed have provided liquidity support to Ukreanica, which is the Ukrainian Railways, which is a key player ensuring that goods can be exported from the country and moving people, but at the same time, we're also looking to explore doing a CapEx loan. And I think it's one important point to say that EBRD is one of the few players that is actually supporting investment in Ukraine at this current time. We've also supported municipalities through liquidity, and last month we signed a loan with the city of Khmelnytsky to support the investment in trolley buses. And we can only do this thanks to the generous support of G7 donors, one of which is the United States, which is helping us providing guarantees. So this is my region. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Let's bring it back to Central Asia with Katya. Tell us about your next 12 to 24 months.
Yes, I cover infrastructure in Central Asia, and in this region we are doing from $500 million to $1 billion a year in investments. At the same time, the investment needs are huge, and I have to say that funding is lacking for this project. So we are trying our best to maximize investments in infrastructure, and that's our main goal in this region, to do more, to finance more infrastructure. Of course, we are doing a lot with public sector. We are providing sovereign loans to the governments in the region, in Central Asia, but also in the Caucasus, Moldova, to finance infrastructure in various sectors. And we can speak a lot about the public sector later on. But of course, without private sector participation, it's not possible to plug the funding gap. So private sector is essential for the development of infrastructure, and we are also, trying our best to support private sector through PPPs. So, and I would like to say that in the region, Kazakhstan has been leading the way, in terms of PPPs. EBRD helped the country to prepare the first properly tendered, internationally tendered project. That's Almaty Ring Road, Almaty Bypass, also called Bakat. It was a project with $750 million US in capex, capital expenditures. The project reached financial closure in 2020, and it's going to be opened in the coming weeks, hopefully in June, so well ahead of schedule. So basically, the private sector proved that they can deliver, in time. So we'll see how it will go. Uzbekistan is trying to follow suit, and they have a large PPP pipeline, about 100 projects in the pipeline, and we have a separate panel on that tomorrow. But I would have to say that we expect more PPP projects to come in schools, dormitories, water, and roads. And we look forward to seeing US firms participating in these projects as investors or as advisors.
Thanks, Katya. And Sue.
Thank you very much, Chanel, and good afternoon, everyone. I think I've been very lucky because Susan and Katya have kind of set the scene a bit for me, so I don't have to sort of set it too much myself. I would say, just as Susan and Katya have mentioned, two things, I think, in terms of objectives. One is decarbonisation, of course. That's very important both in the transport sector, but also in the municipal sector. Also, I would say digitalisation, inclusivity and accessibility to services are also important in the region, and I'll explain a bit more why in a minute. But also bringing in the private sector, because we are seeing pressure in the region. I mean, the region I'm covering, actually, I perhaps should have said, is Türkiye, Middle East and Africa, and we are seeing some pressures on some of those governments in terms of the amount of budget availability they have to spend on things like infrastructure, large railway projects, airport projects, road projects, etc. So it really is important to bring in the private sector. There is a slight difference in the countries I'm working in, because Türkiye, for us, has always been somewhere where we went into that country not intending to do public sector. We have one or two now, and I'll talk a bit more about the earthquake response later on, but typically we're doing private sector business in Türkiye. Not the same in Middle East and Africa. There's a lot more public sector engagement that we have there. But this region, particularly the Africa, Middle East region, you really do see the impact of climate in this region. And the key urgent priority, I would say, in this region is water. Water is very scarce in the region. If you look at Jordan, it's been severely water stressed for some time now. This hasn't improved. The government is trying, but it's a bit of a long process. And now we're also seeing the same. Morocco last year had the worst drought, and I think it was 40 years. So now the government is now having to respond to that issue. And again, even in Egypt, in Tunisia, what the countries are facing is growing water shortage, because on the one hand they're tapping into finite water resources, and yet the population is growing, urbanization is increasing, the climate is affecting the amount of water available. So this is really a key focus of this region. Of course, it has many aspects to it. One of the things we're seeing from an investment point of view, all of these countries are looking at desalination. This is sort of the big thing in the region. It's sort of early days at the moment, and the countries are at different stages, and we're helping them in different ways. So I think Jordan and Morocco are probably the most advanced in this sense. USAID actually has put a lot of technical assistance and support into Jordan to help them with the Amman Aqaba desalination and conveyance project. I've said that the wrong way around in a way, because the desalination will take place in Aqaba, and then the water will be pumped through a 450 kilometer up to Amman. That project is currently in the tendering phase. And where we're helping, we're trying to work with the government, with the other IFIs and the donors, to help the government see how it can put the financing package together. This is going to be a private sector investment, but current estimates are around $4.5 billion. And that's a lot of money. And the affordability of that for the government, if it were all to be financed by the private sector, is enormous. So we're trying to see how we can help with the donor funding, the concessional funding, but also our own support to the government and also to the private sector. The other countries in the region, I mentioned Morocco, their state water and electricity company. They are in the process of tendering a very large desalination plant, not as large as the Aqaba Amman project. I think it's about 550,000 cubic meters per day, whereas the Aqaba Amman is over 800,000 cubic meters per day. Still a very substantial project. This is for the Casablanca area, so that project is currently under tendering. We haven't done the advisory on that one. It's been done by the government. They've done it with their own internal resources and expertise, but we are following the process, and just like the Jordanian project, we hope that once that comes to the market, we will be working with the various, with the sponsors to help that one reach financial close. In Egypt, there we are much more involved at the early stage. So here, our infrastructure project preparation team is working to help the government to develop the project. So they're currently working on 4 projects in the Mediterranean region, much smaller than the other projects I mentioned. The largest is 190,000 cubic meters per day in terms of capacity, and there are some that are about a quarter of that size, so 4 in total. And there is also a project with the Suez Economic Zone, Suez Canal Economic Zone. They are looking to have a very sizable desalination plant, which will help with the development of hydrogen, green hydrogen, which I think Aida mentioned earlier. And it's also, from the point of view of the SC zone in the port, is interesting for the shippers, because they're all looking now to green their shipping operations by using maybe not hydrogen but probably green ammonia, and that will need water for desalination. And in the reverse, the desalination also needs renewable energy in order to make it sustainable. So there's a lot going on in this space. The governments are now in these countries are also starting to think more about water reuse. There is investment of the private sector in water reuse and wastewater treatment. It is something which has limited use in some of these countries, because in some cases they're not really comfortable using it for drinking water, even though it could be used for drinking water. So they're using it for sort of other purposes which are less sensitive, but it's becoming more prevalent. As is, I mean, one of the key things that they have to do from a sustainability point of view is actually upgrade the existing infrastructure and reduce the non-revenue water. So particularly leakages, but also water inefficiency as well is something from a sustainability point of view that has to be done. So I think this is the sort of the key focus. Of course, there are many other things that we're supporting, but in terms of a key objective, water scarcity and addressing this issue is something that is really very important over the coming few years.
Great, thanks, Sue, and thanks everyone for that scene setter. I think one of the things as you're listening, for those of you that might be live streaming online, grab your questions, hang on to your questions, put them in Slido, or send them to Crystal and I. Crystal can raise her hand up there. Later on, we'll have our emails on the screen. The key objective for us here is to pique your interest, to have you want to follow up with Crystal and I to either have conversations with us for U.S. industry, or pass on information and get questions answered by these directors and others inside EBRD. But today, let's focus a little bit more on, let's go down a little bit from the high-level scene setter. And Katja, I'm going to ask you to describe some of those key public sector projects in your pipeline, and why are they important to your countries over the next 2 years?
Yeah, thank you. And I will follow on this water scarcity issue that Sue mentioned. So it's a major issue in my region. And one of the areas we are focusing on is irrigation, so trying to make irrigation systems more efficient. So just 2 months ago, we signed a project here in Uzbekistan to support investments into the irrigation system. It's a $200 million sovereign loan to modernize water conveyance systems in 3 regions of Fergana Valley. This project will not only make the system more efficient, it will contribute positively to the economy, because it will provide new jobs to 19,000 people in Fergana Valley. It also will restore the irrigation area of around 32,000 hectares. So it is a serious impact for this country. So we are trying to do more again in this area. So now looking at the second phase for a similar amount, $200 million here in Uzbekistan. And we're also trying to do a similar project in the irrigation on a smaller scale in Tajikistan. So that's one of the areas. And second area that we are focusing on is transport infrastructure. Given some disruptions of the logistics on the northern route, so the middle corridor has become a hot topic, and it's becoming more popular, and traffic is increasing. So the middle corridor, for those who don't know, is the route from China to Europe via Central Asia and the Caspian Sea and the Caucasus. So investments are needed in railways, in roads, in logistics, in ports, so almost everywhere, along the middle corridor. And all countries in the region are expected to play an important role in developing the middle corridor in the coming years. In the EBRD, we are actively pursuing projects in shipping, in roads, and in logistics. So in these 3 sectors, more to come in the coming years.
Great, thanks, Katja. Aida, I want to turn to you. You mentioned a lot about renewables when you gave your scene setter. Can you talk about the pipeline for renewables in your region over the next 1 to 2 years, say?
Sure. It's actually quite a happening sector in some of our countries. Central Asia, for example, Uzbekistan is certainly leading the way, attracting a lot of interest from foreign sponsors. We are preparing renewable auctions that we welcome everybody to participate in. It's wind, we prepare wind, other MDBs prepare solar auctions. There is a storage component now with everything that comes for tendering. This is because we need to ensure stable networks. So on the renewable side, I think it's actually going from megawatts to gigawatts now in places like Uzbekistan. It's really scaling up, but at the same time, in parallel, preparing the grid, the facility. Neighboring Kazakhstan, a slightly different setup, but also a clear target. In both countries, there is a clear vision and target headline numbers by the government of how much renewables they have to have in the system. Here it's 12 gigawatt by 2030. In Kazakhstan, 15% of the energy mix has to be in renewables also by 2030. So we are working in both countries, different setups, different financing structures. This is Central Asia. These are the 2 major sort of renewables hubs for the bank. We have countries like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, which haven't yet had this wave of renewable projects, but they're very hydropower rich. And they will be, their capacity as a balancing capacity for the big countries with their renewables will be coming of value as the Central Asia united systems, electricity system develops, and they can provide this balancing services. Caucasus is 3 small countries, so it's Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. We signed our first renewable project in Azerbaijan last year, and we want to do more. And we can see the government actively signing up, attracting investors to do gigawatts. And they're also talking offshore wind. Very, very ambitious sort of targets. Georgia and Armenia, it's a smaller scale. It's maybe more sort of measured pace. But also these are countries that historically had hydros, and they want to diversify away from hydros. Then I come to one of our largest markets, which is Turkey. And there it's really a mix of renewables, electricity distribution that we are looking forward to doing more of. Turkey also has a very clear net zero target by 2053, and we want to be part of that big, big movement. Also in Turkey, there's a depth of the market of in industrial and manufacturing base that will be looking for green electricity as mechanisms like CBAM. You know what CBAM is? Is the carbon border adjustment mechanism that when they sell anything to EU, which is their market, unless they produce the manufacture with green electricity, there will be a tax. So, and it's a very deep market on itself. So Turkey will be looking at what's called CNI, corporate and industrial, corporate PPAs, which is very different to what we see here. It's renewables for textile, for cement, for anything, automotive, for any sort of production. And then a fascinating region of the MENA side of things, which we have 4 countries. We have smaller countries, but the key markets are Egypt, Jordan, Tunisia, and Morocco. Each are very different, but one theme there is that we will see as Europe trying to balance climate emergency, climate sort of threat with security of supply. North Africa provides an interesting potential source of green energy to Europe. It's just the question of how it will get there. And whether it will be electrons or molecules, whether it's green hydrogen or it's subsea cables. It's sort of a lot of initiatives, a lot of early stage projects, but this is where the push is. And of course it will be decarbonizing Europe itself and the countries where actually Egypt was the first country where we did our first green hydrogen project. And we look to do more.
Terrific, thank you so much. I'm going to turn quickly to Susan, but I want to shift just a little bit more specific for you. What are your key strategic actions when developing green transportation? Could you give an example in your pipeline that's coming up in maybe the next year or 2?
Transport is one of the areas that we carefully look at because EBRD, all projects we look at need to be Paris-aligned. And given that transport projects have the potential to increase CO2 emissions, we carefully look at how we can green these transactions. Currently, in the transport sector, rail projects are the flavor of the month. We are working very closely with projects in North Macedonia, Corridor 8, a very innovative, exciting project in Serbia, high-speed rail from Belgrade to Niš, in Albania, the Hotihani. These are all sovereign transactions, but they're encouraging the modal shift from road to rail. We also, in the rail sector, are looking at energy efficiency in depots. We have a project that we're working with Serbia Voz in Serbia. And another interesting thing in the private sector, working with rail leasing companies to encourage the acquisition of electric vehicles. But we don't ignore roads. You know, transport is so important for the private sector, for connectivity, access to goods and services. And so when we're looking at road projects, a lot of these tend to be national sovereign transactions. We work with the client to ensure that they are developing a strategy for e-charging so that as more cars move away from internal combustion engines to electric fleets, to electric vehicles, that these roads will be able to support e-charging. And we are looking with some projects, working with the private sector on e-charging investments. I would say when it comes to ports, we love port projects because maritime is one of the greenest way to ship your goods. With ports, we're looking at sustainable fuels, we're looking at decarbonizing cold ironing, ensuring that all the ports equipment is decarbonized. And similarly, we also look at airports. Airports are critical for transport needs, but when we're looking at airports, again, how we can green them, so sustainable fuels, decarbonization of the landside fleet, just making sure that everything in the airport is green, and also looking at access to the airport. I've just focused on national because I think the next few questions will focus on the municipal transport sector. So
great,
back
thanks,
to you.
Susan. Yeah, and in fact they do. So municipal infrastructure projects, really a nice bite size for many American mid-sized companies, right? So they can be many and varied. Maybe give us the top 3 projects, areas that your team is working on in the next few years. And I want to start with Sue this time.
Thank you very much, Chanel. Actually, I might, if I may, also maybe add a couple of transport ones because it is quite relevant for my region. I think the main focus, in a way, and it goes back to the decarbonisation story. One of the key things for me is really to deepen our green cities engagement with our municipalities and the projects we're doing there. We have now 10 green cities in the region I'm covering, which is a relatively small number. Susan will talk a bit later on about green cities in more detail. Her region is the one where it really took off, and Katya also. So we're quite proud that we've got these 10 green cities, and we're adding to them bit by bit. So we've recently added Bursa in Turkey, and that was based on a trigger investment, which is the first investment we do to unlock the green cities engagement. And that was a water supply project. But we also have many metro projects that have triggered green city engagement in the region. Aqaba, I mentioned it earlier in the context of desalination. This is also another city in Jordan that we're hoping to bring into our green city network. We already have Jordan. We have a completed green city action plan there, and we're working through a number of investments with them. So this is really interesting to bring in Aqaba. The 2 things that we're starting out there, one of them is electric buses. This one is by far more straightforward in the sense easier for the city to procure, bit more expensive, so we need blended finance here to help this work. We're also going to be looking at solid waste, which is an enormous issue in the region, very, very difficult to tackle, particularly in some of the bigger countries like Egypt, where the regulations are really not suitable for large-scale rollout of investments, particularly not with the private sector. Beyond Jordan, we're also looking to expand our engagement in Morocco. Last year, we did a green bond with the city of Agadir, and this was our first engagement in Morocco and brought Agadir into the Green Cities program. This year we're working with Gilmim. The project's, again, unsurprisingly, water, to help with the water scarcity. That's the sort of trigger investment. And all of these projects are really, really important, because once we start with this first investment and we bring the city into the Green City program, it means that we can mobilize the technical assistance, so the donor funding, to develop these Green City action plans, which prioritize all the follow-on investments that you would need in order, over a period of time, to green these cities, and also the policy objectives, the policy initiatives that they need to introduce in order to help make the cities greener and more livable. And of course, it's not just about bringing the new cities in. We have a number of cities, particularly in Turkey, but also in Egypt as well, where we need to start thinking beyond whether the Green City action plans are now well developed, and we know what the city knows what the priorities are. So we will be investing in new investments. So in Ankara, in Izmir, in Istanbul, we have large metro projects which are under development, and the contracts for those will be coming to the market. These are done on a sort of sub-sovereign basis with the cities, so they will involve EPC contracts rather than PPPs. Although in Jordan we do have a schools PPP, which our infrastructure project preparation team is preparing, and we're now talking with the government and the sponsors to see how we might finance that, and that would come under the Green Cities program. So a lot happening in the green city space. Mentioning transport just very briefly, if I may, because Susan picked up on ports and logistics, and that's really, really important particularly for North Africa, also Turkey, because it's on that route. It's sort of in the middle from the Far East going out to the Americas. So particularly in North Africa, we're seeing a lot of needed investment, actually, in the port sector and logistics. And it's not just the seaports. We do have projects, quite sizable projects, to help expand the container capacity in particular, both in Morocco and in Egypt, but also the other infrastructure that you need to make those ports function more efficiently. So we have dry ports that we're developing, actually in Turkey as well as in Egypt, in order to make the ports run more efficiently, so where they're constrained in terms of how much you can expand the port. If you go inland, you can take the containers inland and do the customs clearance and the processing to relieve the congestion on the port. And then, of course, how they get from the port to the dry port, the seaport to the dry port, we're helping to develop the rail links to get those containers off the roads onto the railways, so again, continuing the decarbonisation theme. In Morocco, also, they're very keen to emulate the success of Tangier Med port, which has been highly successful, and also not just to, it is to almost create an overflow from Tangier Med, which is now becoming very congested, and there's no more hinterland or room to expand. So they're expanding into Nador, which is in the Oriental region. So this has both an interest from a trade point of view, but also from a development point of view, because the region where it's situated doesn't have much in terms of trade and industry, and so the idea is to create not just a port, but also an industrial zone. It'll also have an energy platform, a logistics platform.
So I'm gonna cut into you just for a second, because I know I'm just looking at time, and I know we started just a little bit late. Yeah, I was just going to say wrap it up, and I'm going to move straight to Katja, and I know that Susan has a couple things on municipal level as well.
Can I just mention one brief thing, because it's a really important thing, just very, very quickly, and that's Türkiye. We all know about the devastating earthquakes that happened in February of this year. This is a region where the infrastructure is completely flattened. And so this is going to be another key area, both on the transport and the municipal side. This year we will do liquidity support to the railways. Next year we're looking at helping the railways to reconstruct, very important links, and also on the municipal side, all of the subsectors that Susan mentioned earlier, these all need to be addressed in Türkiye. So the cities there will also be doing a very big program there to help with the earthquake. So just wanted to mention it because it's a really important point. So.
Terrific. Katja, let's move to you on municipal top three, and then we'll go straight over to Susan after you.
Okay. Thank you, Janelle. So first is decarbonizing of public transport, very similar to my colleagues, in other regions. So just earlier this morning, I don't know whether you've seen, we've signed Samarkand e-bus project, and Samarkand has become our first green city in Uzbekistan. It's a sovereign loan for almost $50 million. The proceeds will be used to finance acquisition of 100 mid-sized buses with charging units and construction of a bus depot. We plan to do more electric transport projects in the region. So we are now working with the cities like Nukus in Uzbekistan and Osh in the Kyrgyz Republic to do similar projects. So second, for me, is modernization of wastewater treatment facilities in Kazakhstan. So at the moment, we are working on 4 projects. Aktobe in Kazakhstan is going to be the pilot project, and the idea is to close the Aktobe project this year. All this financing will be in the form of sovereign loans. And third, from my side, is affordable housing in Mongolia. We are finalizing preparation of our first pilot project. It's going to be a small one for about $20 million, but it will help a lot local residents. So it will improve living conditions for 700 households. And the idea is to move people who are living in GER areas to housing with access to water and centralized water and district heating. It will help to reduce pollution in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. So these are the 3 areas in my region. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Susan?
Hi, I'm just going to talk briefly about what EBRD is doing with green cities in my region. Just last month, we signed a loan with the city of Vilnius, the trolley bus company, to help them move towards totally electrifying their fleet. And what's exciting for me about the city of Vilnius as a green city is that Vilnius is also part of the EU 100 carbon neutral city, where the city comes up with a pathway to try to achieve carbon neutrality by 2030. As you know, Green Cities being our EBRD's flagship municipal program, the key element is the development of the Green City Action Plan to help cities develop what actions and investments they need to take to address their climate change and environmental challenges. So it's very exciting for us to have this. But the other area is also what I want to talk about is decarbonization of heating. And my colleagues Grzegorz and Aida have spoken about renewables. Renewables have been active in the electricity sector for over 20 years. In the heating sector, we're about 20 years behind. So this is an area where we're looking for innovation. Last year, we signed a loan, and we're looking to sign more loans in the Western Balkans. In Pristina, we signed a thermal solar energy district heating project. It's the largest in the region. Pristina is totally dependent on coal. And this is a very exciting project, but we're looking to do more in Serbia. Similarly, we're looking to do in Serbia projects with heat pumps to move away to more innovative forms of investment. And just finally, because we need that innovation, this is an area where private sector can play a role. And I can't name names, but we are looking at some projects which are waste to energy, where there are private sector players involved. And so this is sort of a theme under the Green Cities flag. And back to you, Janelle, because we're short on time.
We're short on time, but we may need to wrap up before we get to our last two. But I think that before I'm going to go to Grzegorz, because he's got some interesting things to say about the energy sector. But again, your questions, please come to us. We'll answer any questions, any follow-up. What you're getting today is just a taste of all the opportunities for U.S. companies and other companies working with EBRD across private and public projects. But let's maybe, Grzegorz, look at you maybe wrapping us up. Really, the greening of electricity, if there's a theme here of anything, it's about green. And let's face it, EBRD has focused for years on green projects, was a target of 40%. Last year, we upped that to a 50% target of all the portfolio on green. Let's talk about the greening of electricity and how EBRD can help scale up expected future demand, and then this creates opportunities for the players in this room.
Thank you very much for the question. I will try to be very brief. Across the EBRD region, and whether that's Europe or somewhere else, we do have countries that really differ a lot in terms of their dependence on fossil fuel for power generation. Just a couple of examples from my region, whether that's Serbia, Kosovo, or Poland. Those countries are 70% plus dependent on coal and lignite. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, you've got Albania that already today doesn't use any fossil fuel for power generation. But even in Albania, there is a need to invest heavily in renewables so that the hydropower plants that power the country today will not be used for base load power generation and be exposed to risk of poor hydrology, but can be used as balancing instruments and can provide the security for the grid so that the grid can absorb more of intermittent solar and wind. So even in Albania, we see a huge need for more for scaling up renewables. Now, how are we going to do all of that? I mean, changing almost 3/3 of total power generation and replacing coal and lignite fired with renewables is going to take years. So neither Serbia nor Poland are going to commit to coal exit by 2028 or 2030. We're really talking about late 40s or maybe 50s. Our role as a development bank is to talk to our clients, our authorities, and do absolutely everything to bring that date forward as much as possible. And that means providing instruments to scaling up renewables. Now, we are not a technology provider. We are not producing solar panels, neither wind turbines, but what we provide is financing. And financing that can be provided not only in the case where there is solid renewable energy support system that provides either a feed-in tariff or contract for difference. We're really looking at offtake arrangements, and that's going to be key in scaling up renewables, for alternative offtake arrangement that will include corporate PPAs, where power purchase agreements are going to be signed by solid energy off-takers, and whether that's municipalities or whether that's large energy-intensive corporates, they can provide off-takes. And the other part, obviously, is the merchant risk. We see more and more interest of investors to saying, look, fine, we would like to do a project, but maybe we will have to wait another 2 or 3 years for this auction to finalize. We're ready to build now. We would like to go merchant. Can you support us? So that's the role for us to come up with this more risky financial instruments that need to be structured differently, but they facilitate development of renewables outside the scheme that has been developed by the authorities. 2 more very quick questions. First, we cannot do the acceleration of renewables without huge investments in increasing grid capacity. Aida mentioned that at the beginning, but I just wanted to draw your attention to the scale of investments. We're talking billions that would be needed to facilitate the connection of renewables to the grid, and sometimes completely redesigning the grid. Because in the past you may have had a large power plant that was the dominant producer of electricity in the country in one location, and now you may have solar PV or wind or offshore wind available somewhat completely different place, and networks will need to be redesigned. That will require huge investment. My very last point, we cannot make all of that just as EBRD and with private sector investors who are very keen to invest. We still need the support and buy-in from the authorities. But what has happened in Ukraine has changed the thinking about energy security. And the fact that the technology has become so much cheaper makes renewables super attractive. By definition, it's cheaper per cost unit, but it's also local. Solar radiation and wind is local. You don't need to import it. You don't rely on someone providing it to you or not. And that's a key element that experience of tragic war in Ukraine has learned us or had taught us, and what we have learned from it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, panel. I just want to say a few words about the panel. So thank you for all this information. As you might imagine, we have just scratched the surface, and this is the Sustainable Infrastructure Group. There are many other sectors that are active inside of EBRD. If we haven't touched on your sector, those of you in the room and those of you online, please, please, I can't urge you enough. This is to give you a taster. We're here to answer questions. Crystal's going to wave her hand. I think that we'll be able to change slides with our emails on them. You can take a picture of the emails or ask us. We are happy to introduce you and help you navigate where you can find opportunities with EBRD-funded projects, whether you are looking for private financing, whether you're looking at potential municipal or government tenders. But we are going to have to wrap up. I'm very, very sorry we won't have time for Q&A, but we will answer all questions. If you put them into Slido or send us an email, all questions will be answered. Another special thank you to Ambassador Hennick for giving our welcoming remarks. And please, let's give a round of applause for our panelists who have talked very fast about so many things today. Great. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.